A lone Marine sat under the desert sun, silent eyes hollowed by years of war. Locals thought he was a drifter. Police thought he was a threat. They sent the K9 unit. But when the dog charged, it froze, then pressed its head into the soldier's chest. This was no routine patrol. It was a reunion the world wasn't supposed to see. Want to know the secret bond that defied orders and time itself? Hit like, tap, subscribe, and let this story carry you. The desert sun was merciless, hanging in the sky like a glowing coin no one could touch. It bleached the cracked pavement, burned the rusted signs of abandoned gas stations, and pressed its weight upon every man and woman who lived under its glare. On the far edge of Miller's Crossing, a town of no more than 200 souls clinging to existence along the Arizona highway, a man sat at a warped bench by a faded bus stop shelter. His name, though no one there knew, it was Captain John Walker. He wore fatigue trousers that had long lost their color, a tan t-shirt darkened with sweat, and boots scuffed by sand and distance. His posture was straight, even as his shoulders bore an invisible weight. He wasn't asleep, and he wasn't lost. He was writing. The notebook in his hand was leather-bound edges, worn paper softened by years of use. His pen moved with quiet certainty, noting lines and symbols that would mean nothing to anyone else. To the occasional trucker rolling past, he looked like a drifter. To the townsfolk glancing from shop windows, he was a shadow that refused to leave. Inside Reed's general store across the street, Anna Reed stood behind the counter polishing the same glass for the third time. She was 48, sharp-eyed, with auburn hair tied back and a limp that marked an old accident. She had seen her share of drifters, but something about this one froze her hands. He wasn't begging, wasn't shifting for shade, wasn't scanning for opportunity. He simply sat there like a statue carved from the desert itself, watching the street without watching. Anna felt the stir of unease coil in her stomach. In a town this small, silence was louder than words. At Miller's Diner, a bell chimed as a group of teenagers slipped inside, buzzing about the man by the bus stop. "He's got no bag," one of them whispered. "Just sitting there like he's waiting for something." The waitress, Laura Miller, looked toward the dusty window where the stranger was just visible. Her son Ethan tugged at her apron and asked if the man was a soldier. Laura hushed him uneasy, not knowing what to say. Back outside, John lifted his head slightly when a gust of dry wind pushed across the street, carrying with it the smell of oil and sagebrush. His eyes were steady blue like glass cooled in fire, but there was no searching in them. He had learned to observe without revealing. Every movement in town, Anna's hand at the curtain, the shuffle of boots outside the diner, the metallic squeal of the gas pump across the road registered silently in his mind. He wasn't hiding. He was waiting. The silence grew heavier with each passing minute. A pair of old men on the porch of the hardware store shifted uncomfortably, exchanging muttered words. One tapped his cane against the wooden step. "No good comes from a man who don't speak," he said. The other nodded. Soon the unease spread like heat shimmer. Mothers pulled children closer. Store doors lingered half shut. Conversations lowered. The man hadn't done a thing, and already suspicion had rooted. John turned another page in his notebook. He wrote with deliberate calm, ignoring the stares, the silence. The coordinates he traced were tied to something larger, something he had promised to observe without interfering. It wasn't his intention to unsettle anyone, but he knew his presence would never blend. Still leaving wasn't an option. Orders had never been optional in his life. From the bench, he could hear the faint hum of a patrol car somewhere in the distance, a low murmur rising and falling with the wind. He closed the notebook gently and rested it on his knee. His jaw tightened just slightly, not from fear, but from recognition. He had lived long enough to know when suspicion would turn into action. By late morning, the desert sun had climbed higher, washing the town in unforgiving light. The stranger remained. Children peered through fences, adults whispered from thresholds, and the hum of tension thickened like storm air before lightning. Yet John Walker did not move. He breathed, he observed, and he waited for what only he knew. The low hum of tires on hot pavement grew louder, breaking the uneasy silence that had settled over Miller's Crossing. The townsfolk who had been lingering in doorways now shifted their eyes, drawn to the approaching sound. From the west end of Main Street, a county patrol car rolled into view, its paint dulled by dust, its engine grumbling like a tired old mule. The car came to a stop a few yards away from the warped bench where Captain John Walker sat. The door opened with a squeak, and Deputy Mark Harris stepped out, adjusting his belt as though it carried more authority than he did. He was in his mid-30s, stocky, with sun-reddened skin and a permanent squint from years under the desert sun. Mark carried himself like a man used to being the loudest presence in a quiet place, and he didn't care much for ambiguity. To him, strangers were problems waiting to happen. He planted his boots firmly on the ground, hands close to his duty belt, and called out across the hot stretch of air between them. "Afternoon, partner," he said, his voice steady but edged with suspicion. "You planning on sitting here all day, or do you got a destination in mind?" John lifted his head slowly, his blue eyes fixing on the deputy without a flicker of unease. He didn't move to rise, didn't make any sudden gestures. Instead, he laid his hands openly on his knees, palms visible in a gesture that carried more discipline than surrender. His voice, when it came, was deep and even, the kind of voice trained to cut through chaos without raising volume. "Just passing through," he replied. The answer was short, deliberate, leaving no room for debate, yet offering nothing more than what was asked. Mark frowned. He didn't like short answers, and he didn't like men who kept their stories sealed. He stepped closer, boots crunching on the gravel, his eyes narrowing at the dusty fatigues and scuffed boots that John wore. They spoke of service, of discipline, but without insignia or name tag. They also whispered of secrets. "You got ID on you?" Mark asked, his tone firmer now, his hand hovering near the edge of his holster, though he had no reason yet to draw. For a moment John said nothing. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of wind pushing grit along the street. Then John reached toward the chest pocket of his shirt, stopping halfway as if reconsidering. His jaw tightened, the faintest shadow crossing his face. "Not on me," he said at last. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth. His identification was real, more real than Mark could imagine, but it carried a clearance level that would raise more questions than it answered. Questions John could not afford. The deputy tilted his head, suspicion sharpening. "Not on you." "You mean to tell me you're sitting out here in the middle of town dressed like that with no name to show for yourself?" He crossed his arms, squinting against the glare, waiting for a slip, a twitch, any sign of nerves. But John remained steady, his eyes calm, his breathing slow. He had faced worse interrogations in harsher lands. One deputy in a dusty town could not shake him. "That's correct," John replied. "I'm not looking for trouble." Behind him, a screen door creaked open at Reed's General Store. Anna Reed stepped outside, shading her eyes with one hand, her gaze flicking between the deputy and the soldier. She didn't speak, but her presence was enough to add weight to the moment. Other townsfolk watched too, from the diner windows, from porches and sidewalks, their whispers rising with the dry wind. A stranger with no name, a deputy pressing harder, and a silence that refused to break it, was a scene begging for escalation. Mark's radio crackled at his side, a voice asking for a status update. He raised it to his shoulder and muttered, "Suspicious drifter, no ID, sitting by the freight lane." The words were routine, but the look in his eyes said otherwise. He saw more than a drifter. He saw control in every movement, a stillness that didn't belong to desperation, but to discipline. "You mind standing up for me?" Mark asked, his hand still resting near his holster. John nodded once unhurried and rose from the bench with the kind of deliberate calm that only veterans carried. He kept his hands visible, fingers relaxed, shoulders squared. There was no defiance in him, only the weight of a man who had walked too many lines between danger and restraint. The deputy circled him slowly, scanning for weapons, finding none. Only the notebook remained tucked firmly in John's hand. "What's in there?" Mark asked, gesturing. John glanced down at the worn cover. "Notes," he said simply. The deputy stepped closer, curiosity flickering with irritation. "Mind if I take a look?" John's eyes held steady. "I'd rather you didn't." The refusal was polite but firm, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Mark didn't know what was in that notebook, but he knew it wasn't the kind of thing he wanted to stumble into. He tightened his jaw, radioing again. "Might need another unit out here," he muttered. The townsfolk sensed the shift. Whispers grew louder. Feet shuffled and eyes fixed on the unfolding standoff. A stranger who refused to explain himself, a deputy who wouldn't let go, and a silence that pressed harder with each passing second. The desert heat seemed to lean in, waiting for the break. John remained still, his hands loose at his sides, his gaze never leaving the deputy. He wasn't challenging, but he wasn't yielding either. He knew where this was headed, and he knew it was only the beginning. The second patrol car pulled up in a slow roll of dust, its tires crunching against the grit as Deputy Mark Harris motioned for backup to join him. The driver was Lieutenant Carl Dawson, a man in his late 40s whose posture was as rigid as the pressed seams of his uniform. Dawson stepped out tall and stiff, his eyes scanning the stranger with an expression of distrust already set. He didn't like the look of John Walker, too calm, too deliberate, too unshaken by authority. To Dawson, that steadiness was not confidence, it was threat. "What do we have?" Dawson asked, his voice clipped. Mark gestured toward John, who still stood near the bench, notebook in hand. "No ID, no explanation. Claims he's just passing through." Dawson's gaze narrowed. "We'll see about that." He stepped forward, holding out his hand toward the worn notebook. John's grip tightened almost imperceptibly, but after a moment of hesitation, he offered it. Dawson flipped it open, expecting names or ramblings of a drifter. Instead, he found pages lined with coordinates, numbers, and symbols written in precise, steady handwriting. His brow furrowed. "What exactly is this?" he asked. John's tone remained calm. "Observations." The lieutenant's eyes sharpened. "Observations of what?" "Not everything needs to be said out loud." John replied, his voice low but steady. Dawson snapped the notebook shut and handed it to Mark. "Search him," he ordered. Mark complied, patting down John's fatigues and boots, checking for hidden weapons. He found nothing. No wallet, no identification, no concealed blade, just a soldier's worn frame and silence that pressed heavier than words. "Nothing but the book," Mark said, his voice tinged with frustration. Dawson exhaled through his nose, unimpressed. "Men don't carry notebooks full of coordinates unless they're watching something they shouldn't be watching." Around them, the crowd had grown. A handful of townsfolk had stepped closer, curious but cautious, murmuring to one another as the heat rippled above the street. From the edge of a chain-link fence nearby, a boy's voice rose above the murmurs. "Is he in trouble?" All heads turned. Ethan Miller, no more than 10 years old, stood clutching a cup of lemonade, his jeans grass-stained, his hair sticking up in the back as if he'd run here in a hurry. His wide eyes fixed on John, unblinking. Dawson scowled. "Go home, son. This doesn't concern you." But Ethan didn't move. He stepped closer to the fence, his voice clear, despite the nervous tremor beneath it. "He looks like the man in Grandpa's picture," the boy said. A ripple of silence moved through the crowd. Dawson stiffened. Mark glanced toward the boy, and even Anna Reed leaned forward from her spot outside the store. John's eyes flickered just slightly, but enough for anyone watching closely to notice. Ethan's words carried weight. Children often spoke without calculation, and that innocence could pierce where suspicion faltered. "What picture?" Dawson asked sharply, his tone more interrogation than curiosity. Ethan's small chest rose and fell quickly. "The one in Grandpa Frank's album. The picture of the convoy. There was a soldier and a dog. Mom said it was a long time ago, but it looks like him." His finger pointed directly at John. John's jaw clenched, his eyes lowering for the first time since the deputies arrived. The crowd began to stir, whispers thickening like dust storms swirling across the desert. Anna Reed's gaze hardened with a new intensity. She remembered Frank Miller's stories, half dismissed as the ramblings of an old veteran, but always told with conviction. Dawson waved his hand impatiently. "That's enough. Get him out of here." But Ethan didn't back down. His small fists tightened around the plastic cup. "He saved people. Grandpa said the soldier saved the convoy when the road was ambushed. He said the man had a dog who wouldn't leave his side." The weight of his words settled on the group like the stillness before thunder. Mark's frown deepened. Dawson shifted, uncomfortable under the collective stare of the townsfolk. John remained motionless, his silence louder now than any defense could have been. "That's a nice story, kid," Dawson said brusquely, "but stories don't prove a thing." Yet his voice carried a crack of uncertainty. He turned back to John. "You've got one chance to explain yourself. What are these coordinates and why are you here?" John looked up, meeting Dawson's gaze evenly. "I already told you. Observations, nothing more." Dawson's lips pressed thin, his hand brushing the edge of his belt. The heat around them seemed to intensify, the hum of cicadas growing louder, the tension palpable. Anna Reed stepped forward, her limp more pronounced in the glare of the sun. "Lieutenant," she said firmly, "if that boy's right, maybe you ought to think twice before you treat this man like a drifter." Dawson's jaw tightened, but he didn't reply. The crowd had turned not into a mob, but into witnesses unwilling to look away. The boy's words had cracked the surface of suspicion, leaving something raw and unsettled in their wake. John stood still silent, his notebook gone, but his presence unbroken. He knew the path had shifted. Secrets he had carried were no longer his alone. The air over Miller's Crossing grew heavier as Lieutenant Carl Dawson kept his gaze locked on John Walker. The notebook, with its cryptic coordinates, still in Deputy Mark Harris's grip. The murmurs of the gathered townsfolk rippled through the silence, carried by the heat like low static. Ethan Miller clutched his empty lemonade cup tighter, his eyes still fixed on the soldier, and his small voice echoed in the memory of everyone nearby. "He looks like the man in Grandpa's picture." Dawson didn't like how quickly the crowd's doubt had shifted toward curiosity, and he signaled toward the radio on his shoulder. With a clipped voice, he requested a K-9 unit from the County Tactical Division, saying it was standard procedure. The words sounded official, but the weight of suspicion in his tone made it clear he wanted proof that this stranger was dangerous. The crowd thinned slightly at the edges as the sound of another engine approached, deeper and steadier than the patrol cars. A white SUV rolled into view, its blue insignia barely visible through a layer of dust, and it parked sharply behind Dawson's car. The rear door opened with a mechanical hiss, and Officer Megan Scott stepped out. She was in her early 30s, athletic, her dark hair tied back tightly in regulation style, and her stance revealed a discipline forged through both training and trial. Her eyes scanned the scene quickly before settling on John, measuring every angle of his posture. Then, with a simple command, she released her partner. From the back of the SUV leapt a German shepherd, strong and alert, his coat a mix of sable and black, his body moving with precision. His name stenciled on the vest he wore was Ranger. The crowd instinctively pulled back, whispers rising. Children clutched their mothers' skirts. Old men shifted their weight uneasily, and Anna Reed narrowed her eyes from her place outside the store. Dawson smirked faintly, as if certain that the truth would reveal itself now in fur and fangs. Megan gave Ranger the command to focus her voice firm and practiced. The dog's ears perked, his eyes locked onto John, and the weight of expectation pressed down on the street. Everyone braced for the inevitable lunge, but it never came. Ranger froze. His ears flattened, his tail lowered, and his eyes, sharp and intelligent, widened with something that was not aggression but recognition. A hush fell instantly. The dog tilted his head, one paw edging forward slowly, uncertainly. Then, as if a long-closed memory had split open, Ranger whined a soft, tremulous sound that seemed to pierce the still heat. Megan blinked, momentarily stunned. This was not protocol, not the reaction drilled into Ranger through years of training. She repeated the command sharper this time, but Ranger didn't respond. Instead, he stepped closer to John, his movements deliberate yet trembling, as though pulled by something deeper than discipline. John remained still, his hands visible but his eyes softened, a rare shift breaking through his calm facade. Slowly, deliberately, he extended one open hand, palm up, toward the shepherd. The dog moved forward, closing the distance in quiet steps until his snout pressed into John's open hand. The sound that followed was a whimper, a small breaking sound that cut through the silence heavier than any order could. Ranger leaned into John's chest, his body pressing close, his breath steadying against the fabric of the soldier's shirt. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Ethan dropped his cup to the ground, his mouth parted in awe. Anna Reed's sharp eyes flickered with something that might have been recognition of her own, not of the dog, but of the bond she saw before her. Dawson's face flushed, caught between disbelief and irritation, his control slipping before the weight of the moment. "What is this?" He barked, his voice rougher than intended. Megan took a step closer, her composure cracking for the first time in years of handling K-9 operations. He's never done this," she murmured, her eyes wide. "He's breaking protocol." John's hand rested gently against Ranger's head, his voice low, almost a whisper. "He remembers." Megan stared, uncertain whether she had heard correctly. "What did you say?" John's lips tightened, but his eyes stayed on the shepherd. "He remembers me." The crowd stirred louder, their unease shifting now into something heavier, almost reverent. Ethan's eyes shone as he tugged at his mother's apron, whispering, "It's him." Grandpa was right. Dawson tried to cut through the rising noise. Dogs don't just remember strangers from the street. He snapped, his tone brittle. But Ranger didn't move away. He sat down beside John, leaning against his leg, his tail twitching softly against the dust. The discipline of years, the training of countless drills, all undone in a single act of loyalty that no command could override. Megan crouched slowly, hesitant to interrupt, her eyes darting between the soldier and her partner. She saw no fear in Ranger, no tension ready to spring, only recognition so deep it unsettled her. She spoke carefully. "What's his name?" John's voice was steady, but it carried an undercurrent of emotion he had not allowed to surface in years. "Ranger," he said, but then added quietly, "That's what they call him now. It wasn't always his name." Megan frowned. "What was it?" John paused, his eyes distant, as if pulling the word from the dust of years gone by. He whispered a name no one in Miller's Crossing had ever heard before, a name that made Ranger's ears perk as if answering a call long lost. The shepherd pressed closer, his body trembling not from fear but from something remembered. Megan's breath caught. She had trained this dog, trusted him in raids, and yet she knew in that moment she was witnessing something that did not belong to her. The crowd felt it too. The silence became reverent, the kind of silence that accompanies church pews and flag-draped coffins. A bond had revealed itself, older than orders, deeper than protocol. And in that bond, suspicion gave way to something none of them were prepared to face. The heat of the desert pressed down on Miller's Crossing, yet no one in the growing crowd felt it now. All eyes were fixed on the soldier and the German shepherd, who sat pressed against his leg as though guarding him against the entire world. Officer Megan Scott knelt just a few feet away, her hands hovering uncertainly as she tried to reconcile what she was seeing with years of training that told her this moment should not exist. Lieutenant Carl Dawson shifted uneasily, the lines in his face etched deeper by confusion, while Deputy Mark Harris tightened his grip on the notebook as if it alone could anchor reason. John Walker's hand rested firmly on the shepherd's head, and in his eyes flickered a glint of something long buried. His lips moved with a whisper, one word carried not for the crowd, but for the dog at his side. Valor. The name hung in the still air like a bell struck in a chapel, low yet resonant. The shepherd's ears lifted, his body stiffened, and then he leaned closer, pressing his head against John's chest with a soft chuff that trembled between recognition and relief. The crowd gasped, not from knowing the name, but from sensing the truth of the exchange. Megan's throat tightened. "What did you just call him?" John's gaze did not waver from the dog. "His name is Valor. That's who he was before he disappeared." Megan's breath caught. She had seen the dog's personnel file when she received him 2 years earlier, yet it had carried a designation, not a name, a string of letters and numbers that reduced the animal to equipment. She swallowed hard. "He came to me as Ranger. He was already reassigned." John's hand stroked the fur gently, the first softness he had allowed himself since arriving in the town. He was never reassigned in his heart. Dawson stepped forward, his voice cutting the tension. "That's enough. Dogs don't remember their past handlers like that, not after years. You're making claims without proof." Megan's eyes flickered between the soldier and her partner, her instincts battling procedure. Finally, she reached for the handheld scanner clipped to her belt. She hesitated only briefly before moving closer to the shepherd. "Hold him steady," she said. John didn't move, but Valor didn't resist either. He remained pressed against the soldier's side, his breathing calm, his eyes locked with John's as if anchored by the name he had waited years to hear again. Megan passed the scanner slowly across the base of his neck. A faint beep broke the silence, and the device displayed a sequence of numbers. Megan's hands trembled slightly as she read the record. Her voice cracked before she steadied it. Chip ID VLR 29. Prior designation Valor. Presumed killed in action. 5 years ago. The words struck the crowd like a gust of wind through dry grass. Murmurs swelled disbelief mixing with awe. Ethan Miller's eyes widened as he tugged at his mother's hand. "See, Mom? It's him. It's really him." Laura Miller pulled her son closer, her face pale with shock, yet touched with something deeper, almost reverent. Anna Reed crossed her arms tightly, her sharp gaze softened by the weight of memory. She remembered when news of the Kandahar convoy had reached even their remote town, a fleeting headline in a world too busy to dwell on sacrifice. And now, here stood the man and the dog the story had never named. Dawson's face flushed. He jabbed a finger toward John. "Even if that's true, it doesn't change the fact that you refuse to identify yourself, that you're here with no clearance writing God knows what in that notebook. This isn't proof of innocence. It's more reason to suspect you." His voice carried authority, but his words faltered under the pressure of the townsfolk who no longer looked at John as a drifter. They looked at him as something else, something their hearts struggled to define. Megan rose slowly, still holding the scanner, her eyes fixed on John. "You served with him?" she said, not as a question, but as a truth. John nodded once, his voice low but steady. "Kandahar. He dragged me out after the blast. I thought he was gone. They told me no one survived." Valor shifted, laying his chin on John's boot, as if sealing the memory with quiet confirmation. The sight was too much for Ethan, who slipped free from his mother's grasp and ran closer, stopping just short of the shepherd. His voice was high but clear. "Grandpa said the dog saved the convoy. He said the soldier never left him behind." John looked down at the boy, his expression softening in a way that startled even himself. "Your grandpa remembers true," he said. Dawson bristled, unwilling to lose his grip on the situation. He gestured sharply toward Megan. "That dog belongs to the government. He is property, and his place is with his handler, not some stranger spinning stories from the past." But the word property landed heavy sour in the ears of the crowd. Anna Reed stepped forward, her limp slowing her but not softening her resolve. "That isn't property," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the heat. "That's loyalty. You can't scan that into a database." The murmurs rose again, this time with agreement. The town no longer passive witnesses, but participants in a reckoning they hadn't expected when the day began. Megan looked at Valor once more, then at John, her hands tightening on the scanner. She knew protocol demanded she remove the dog immediately, return him to the unit, report the breach. But standing here watching the shepherd lean against the soldier who spoke his true name, she realized she was standing at the edge of a choice that was no longer just about orders. The silence deepened, carrying with it the weight of history, of sacrifice, of bonds forged in places most of these townsfolk could never imagine. And in that silence, the future of the man and the dog hung fragile, waiting for the next move that would decide whether recognition became reunion or conflict. The confirmation of Valor's identity hung in the dry air like smoke that refused to clear. Officer Megan Scott lowered the scanner, her hands trembling slightly while John Walker remained kneeling beside the German shepherd, who leaned against him with a trust that no order could break. The townsfolk whispered some voices carrying awe, others skepticism. The moment had cracked something open in Miller's Crossing, and everyone felt the weight of choosing where to stand. Anna Reed was the first to step forward. Her limp slowed her, but her voice was strong. "You all saw it," she said, her eyes moving across the gathered faces. "That's not training. That's recognition. That's family." Ethan Miller clutched his mother's hand, his face glowing with conviction. "Grandpa was right." He whispered, his words echoing in the hush. Laura Miller held him close, her eyes fixed on John with a mixture of caution and sympathy. From the porch of the diner, an older man with a battered hat nodded slowly. "I've seen bonds like that," he said, his voice gravelly. "Men don't fake that kind of thing. Neither do dogs." His words drew murmurs of agreement, but not all faces were softened. From the edge of the crowd, a heavy-set shopkeeper named Bill Carter shook his head sharply. "Or maybe we just saw a man who knew the right name to say," he retorted, his voice loud enough to cut the reverence. "Dogs get trained, retrained, reassigned." How do we know this isn't some trick? Dawson seized on the words instantly, his eyes narrowing as he turned back toward the crowd. "Exactly. He refuses to show ID, he fills a notebook with codes, and now suddenly the dog belongs to him. Convenient, isn't it?" A murmur of unease rolled through the townsfolk. Some shifted their weight, glancing at one another, caught between the raw honesty of the reunion and the sharp edge of suspicion planted by authority. Anna's jaw tightened, her voice rising. "Convenient. That animal remembered a name no one here knew. Do you think he rehearsed 5 years of silence for this moment?" "Bill." Carter crossed his arms stubbornly. "All I'm saying is, I've seen men pull stunts for sympathy. Maybe he knew about the dog's past. Maybe he found a way to make himself look like some hero. You people ever think about that?" Ethan pulled free of his mother's grasp and stepped closer, his voice rising with the urgency only a child could muster. "He's not lying. Grandpa told me the story. He said the soldier and the dog never left each other. He said if one lived, the other would find him again." His words stilled the murmurs cutting through adult logic with unfiltered belief. Laura hurried forward, pulling Ethan back, but the damage was done. The boy's conviction had pressed itself into the silence like an unshakable truth. Megan Scott rose to her feet, her gaze heavy on John. "There's something here," she admitted quietly, but her tone carried conflict. She had worked with Ranger for years, trusted him with her life, and now she was watching him choose another. It felt like losing something she had never truly owned. Dawson's patience snapped. "Enough," he barked. "This man is under suspicion, and the dog is government property. Anyone who thinks otherwise is ignoring the law." His words struck hard, but they rang hollow against the sight before them. Valor curled at John's side, unmovable. From the far end of the street, another voice rose, this one belonging to Reverend Paul Lewis, a tall man in his 60s who had served in Vietnam before returning to preach in Miller's Crossing. He stepped forward with his weathered Bible tucked under one arm. "Lieutenant," he said evenly, "I respect the law, but I also respect what my eyes tell me. That dog isn't following training. He's following memory. Memory is not government property." His words stirred the crowd again, drawing nods from some while others remained stiff, caught between fear of authority and the pull of what they had witnessed. Bill Carter's voice cut in again, sharper this time. "And what if memory is just a trick? What if he's playing us, dragging this whole town into something bigger than we want?" A few heads nodded reluctantly, townsfolk wary of strangers and the trouble they often carried. Suspicion clung stubbornly, refusing to vanish. John remained silent through it all, his hand resting on Valor's neck, his eyes calm yet shadowed. He had learned long ago that truth rarely shouted. It waited steady until the noise burned itself out. But here in this town, silence felt like both shield and weapon. Megan finally spoke, her tone carrying a quiet authority. "I've worked with him for 2 years. He's never once disobeyed. Not once. Until today." Her eyes shifted to John. "And he disobeyed because of you. That's not something I can explain away." Dawson's jaw clenched. "You don't need to explain it. You just need to follow protocol." The tension split the crowd cleanly in two. On one side stood those moved by what they had seen, people who believed in loyalty that transcended orders, who saw John not as a threat, but as a brother who had never left his comrade behind. On the other side stood those hardened by suspicion, people who saw manipulation in every gesture and danger in every secret. The desert heat shimmered between them, amplifying the division, drawing a line in the dust that no one wanted to cross, yet everyone felt. Ethan's small voice rose again, quieter now, but steady. "Sometimes you don't need proof. You just need to see." His words lingered, fragile yet piercing. Dawson looked at the boy with irritation, but for once he didn't answer. His radio crackled at his side, a signal from the county dispatch. He raised it, his face tightening as he listened. Reinforcements were already on the way. The radio at Lieutenant Carl Dawson's side hissed again, louder this time, carrying words he barely understood, before another sound broke across the town. The low rumble of an engine heavier than any patrol car drifted down Main Street, growing until even the murmuring crowd fell silent. Heads turned as a black SUV rolled into Miller's Crossing. Its windows tinted its movement deliberate, not hurried as though the driver already knew every pair of eyes would be waiting. The vehicle stopped at the edge of the gathered crowd, its presence cutting through the heat like a blade through canvas. A door opened and a tall man stepped out. His suit was plain, his tie dark, his shoes coated in a film of dust from the long road. He moved with a calm precision that made even Dawson's shoulders stiffen. A badge glinted briefly in his hand before he slid it back into his pocket. "Agent Samuel Cross," he said, his voice low but carrying enough command to silence the murmurs. "Federal Operations." The words hung heavy, reshaping the air. Dawson straightened his authority, shrinking under the weight of a higher power. "What's your business here?" Agent Cross's gaze swept the scene, lingering on John Walker, kneeling still beside Valor. "My business," he said carefully, "is him." He stepped closer, the crowd parting reluctantly. Unease, thick in the desert heat. Captain John Walker, United States Marine Corps Reconnaissance Division. Clearance above your pay grade. Cross continued, his eyes flicking toward Dawson with a cool finality. You're operating outside your jurisdiction, Lieutenant. This man is on assignment. Dawson bristled, his face flushing. Assignment? He's been loitering in my town with no ID, filling a notebook with codes, and now we have a dog breaking training protocols. If you think I'm stepping aside, Cross cut him off with a slight raise of his hand. It's not about what I think. It's about what's already in motion. Walker was deployed here on a classified observation mission, unofficial, unacknowledged, and meant to remain unseen until you turned it into a spectacle. His tone was measured, not sharp, but the rebuke landed all the same. The crowd stirred, their whispers swelling. Laura Miller clutched Ethan tighter, uncertain whether this revelation brought safety or more danger. Anna Reed's sharp gaze held steady on Cross, as if weighing whether to trust this man who had arrived cloaked in authority. John remained silent, his hand still resting on Valor, his eyes steady, unflinching. Cross's attention shifted now to the shepherd. His jaw tightened just slightly, though his voice remained calm. As for the dog, this animal is registered property of federal operations. He is classified as tactical equipment reassigned under the designation Ranger. His presence here is a complication. The words struck like stones. The crowd stiffened, and then the murmurs rose louder, sharper, laced with outrage. Bill Carter nodded vigorously, seizing the chance to strengthen his suspicion. You see, even the feds say it. That dog isn't his. He belongs to the government. But Anna Reed's voice cut through, immediately fierce and unshaken. You don't call family property. Reverend Paul Lewis stepped forward, his weathered face darkened by disappointment. I buried too many boys who thought of themselves as equipment. A dog that drags a soldier out of fire isn't a tool. He's a comrade. Ethan's voice broke in higher urgent. He's not a weapon. He's valor. His small hands clenched at his sides as if holding on to the truth with all his strength. Laura tried to hush him, but the boy's words had already threaded through the crowd, drawing nods and muttered agreement. Cross didn't flinch, though his expression betrayed a flicker of something heavier. I understand your feelings, he said slowly, but understand this as well. Federal jurisdiction overrides sentiment. That animal has been and remains a government asset. His reassignment was sanctioned years ago. Whatever bond you think you see is irrelevant to the law. Megan Scott's voice rose for the first time, carrying both conflict and defiance. With respect, Agent, I've handled him for years. I know protocol, but I've never seen anything like this. He isn't just responding to commands, he's remembering. If memory is irrelevant to you, then why did he break training the second he saw this man? Cross turned his gaze to her, his tone steady but edged with finality. Because instinct doesn't change his designation. He is Property Officer Scott, not family. The crowd erupted, their voices overlapping, some calling out in defense of John and Valor, others wary of federal authority. Dawson tried to regain control, shouting above the noise, but his words were drowned by the swell of outrage. John finally rose to his feet, his posture steady, his voice calm, but carrying through the tumult. You can call him property. You can call me compromised, but you cannot deny what you saw. His words quieted the crowd for a breath, enough for his gaze to lock with Cross. He remembers. So do I. That's not something you erase with a file or a designation. Cross's jaw clenched, though his expression remained composed. He looked away, briefly scanning the horizon as though weighing his next move, then returned his focus. Be that as it may. Captain, you've compromised your cover. Reinforcements are on their way. Both of you will be transported out for debriefing. That's non-negotiable. The words sealed the moment. The crowd's protests swelled again, but authority had declared its line. Dawson exhaled, half satisfied, half resentful at being overshadowed. Megan stared at Valor, torn between her training and the truth unfolding before her. Anna Reed's eyes narrowed, her mind racing with thoughts of what this meant for her town, for her own grief. Ethan clutched his mother's apron tighter, whispering, "They can't take him." John rested his hand once more on Valor's back, steady, calm, resolute. The battle lines had shifted not of gunfire but of loyalty and law, and the next move would decide whether this bond endured or was torn apart. The tension in Miller's Crossing had reached a breaking point. Agent Samuel Cross stood like a shadow cut from stone, his words about government property and classified missions still hanging in the air. Lieutenant Carl Dawson shifted with impatience, eager to reclaim authority, yet wary of the badge that outranked his. The townsfolk pressed closer, their murmurs filling the heat with rising doubt and defiance. In the center of it all stood John Walker with Valor at his side, his hand resting firmly on the dog's back, his eyes steady as the weight of accusation and loyalty bore down on him. John drew a slow breath, the kind of breath a man takes before laying bare something he never meant to share. His voice, when it came, was calm but carved with memory. "You want the truth?" he said, his gaze moving from Dawson to Cross, and then to the faces of the townsfolk who had gathered in fragile silence. 5 years ago, Kandahar. The convoy was ambushed. I was pinned down, fire coming from every side. I couldn't move, couldn't even raise my head. I should have died there. His hand pressed gently into Valor's fur. But he didn't let me. He crawled through fire and dragged me out. Not a man, not a medic. Him. This dog. His voice grew quieter, yet each word carried weight that bent the air. He saved me. Not once. Not twice. Every time the blast came too close, every time I thought the sand would bury me, he was there. He was more than my partner. He was my lifeline. The crowd shifted, their breaths catching. Anna Reed's eyes softened, her hand tightening at her side as though gripping something invisible. Reverend Lewis lowered his head briefly, his lips moving as if in silent prayer. Laura Miller drew Ethan close, yet her eyes stayed fixed on John, drawn by the depth of his confession. Cross's face remained unreadable, but a muscle ticked at his jaw. Dawson scoffed, though the sound rang hollow. "Stories," he muttered. "Just stories. You expect us to believe that an animal dragged you through bullets? That's convenient for a man who refuses to explain himself." John's eyes locked on him, calm but unyielding. "I don't need you to believe me. I lived it. He lived it. The scars on us both tell more than words ever will." The air thickened, the heat pressing harder as though the desert itself held its breath. Then the moment cracked. Dawson stepped closer, his hand darting toward John's chest as though to seize the notebook Mark Harris still carried, or perhaps to shove him back into submission. The move was too sharp, too sudden. In an instant, Valor rose, his body a wall of muscle and loyalty, pressing himself between John and the deputy. His ears pinned back, his stance low, his eyes locked with fierce focus on Dawson. A growl rumbled low in his throat, not wild but controlled, the kind of warning born of training and instinct fused. The crowd gasped. Megan Scott's eyes widened. Her hand flying toward her belt, but she froze, realizing this was not attack but protection. "He's guarding," she whispered, half to herself, half to anyone who could hear. Dawson froze too. His hand halted midair, the weight of every gaze upon him. Valor didn't lunge, didn't snap. He simply stood, unmovable, a sentinel between the man he had saved once before and the threat that rose again. Ethan cried out, "He's protecting him, just like Grandpa said." The words rang through the street, breaking what little authority Dawson had left. He stepped back slowly, his face red with anger and humiliation. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, now edged with awe. To them, the scene was no longer abstract. It was proof, living and breathing before their eyes. Valor's growl faded as John laid a calming hand on his back. The dog settled, though he remained firmly planted, his body angled protectively. John's voice came low but steady, cutting through the noise. He was trained to protect, yes. But what you just saw, that wasn't training. That was memory. That was choice. Megan Scott exhaled slowly, her conflict deepening. She had worked side by side with Ranger, trusted him with her safety, yet she had never seen this depth of loyalty. It stirred something she couldn't dismiss. Cross stepped forward, his face composed but his tone sharper. "Captain, you've just confirmed what we already know. This animal retains combat conditioning. That makes him valuable, and that makes him ours." His words met with immediate protest from the townsfolk, voices overlapping in rising defiance. "He's not a weapon," Anna Reed shouted. "He's a soldier's brother," Reverend Lewis added. "And no government owns loyalty." The crowd swelled louder, their voices cutting across the authority of badge and title. Dawson muttered curses under his breath, his hand twitching toward his holster before he thought better of it. Cross held his ground, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease at the way control was slipping. John stood taller now, his hand steady on Valor, his voice calm yet unshakable. "You can call him property. You can call me compromised. But he is not a weapon. He is a life that carried me out when no one else could. If you think you can take that away, then you have forgotten what it means to serve." Silence struck once more, heavy and reverent, as the truth in his words settled deep. The townsfolk divided moments before began to lean together, drawn by the undeniable sight of loyalty embodied before them. The desert wind picked up, carrying dust through the street, swirling around as though nature itself echoed the unrest. The sound of rotors far in the distance cut faintly into the air, a low thrum barely audible yet enough to draw John's eyes toward the horizon. Reinforcements were coming, and with them choices no longer delayed. The rising noise of the townsfolk clashed with the rigid commands of Agent Samuel Cross, creating a storm of voices that filled Miller's Crossing. Valor remained planted at John Walker's side, his body steady, his eyes calm yet alert, a living wall of loyalty that silenced doubts more effectively than any words. Dawson's face burned with frustration, his authority slipping further with each passing moment, while Megan Scott stood frozen, caught between the rigid pull of protocol and the undeniable truth before her. In the midst of the growing tension, a faint glow flickered among the crowd. A teenager no more than 16 held up his cracked phone, the screen reflecting the image of John and Valor side by side. His hands trembled as he whispered to his friend, "This needs to be seen." The friend nodded, raising another phone, catching the angle as Valor pressed against John's leg, as Dawson's hand halted in midair as the bond between man and dog defied command. The crowd shifted, some noticing, but no one stopped them. The scene was already slipping beyond the borders of Miller's Crossing. Within minutes, the video uploaded to social media. It showed no commentary, no editing, only raw footage of a soldier and a shepherd recognizing each other in the heat of suspicion. The caption was simple. They called him property. The dog called him family. By the time the sound of approaching rotors grew louder over the horizon, the video had begun its journey. At first it was seen by a handful of strangers scrolling through feeds in faraway cities. Then it caught the attention of veterans groups, shared with captions of salute emojis and words like brotherhood, loyalty, and never forgotten. Comments multiplied, stories surfaced of soldiers who had been saved by dogs, of dogs who had waited by coffins of bonds that had never broken even under fire. Within an hour, the video crossed 1 million views. News outlets picked it up, headlines forming like wildfire reunion in the Desert Soldier and Dog Defy Orders. Clips ran on local channels, anchors speaking of loyalty beyond protocol, and callers flooding phone lines with their own stories of service and sacrifice. Back in Miller's Crossing, no one yet knew how far the moment had spread. They only sensed the shift in the air. Laura Miller's phone buzzed in her apron pocket, a message from her sister 2 towns over. "Is that your boy in the video?" "It's everywhere." Laura's hands trembled as she glanced at Ethan, who still clung to her side, eyes wide with awe. Anna Reed's niece away at college texted her a screenshot of the footage with the words, "This is going viral. Is that your town?" Anna's lips pressed thin, her eyes flickering toward John, realizing the story had already slipped from their grasp. Cross's phone buzzed too. He glanced at the notification, his face hardening as he realized control was evaporating faster than desert rain. Dawson caught the change, his own unease deepening. "What's happening?" he demanded. Cross didn't answer immediately, but his eyes betrayed the truth. The story was no longer local. It was national, and soon it would be global. Megan Scott finally stepped forward, her voice low but firm. "They've already seen it, haven't they?" Cross gave a slight nod, his jaw tight. "The narrative has left our hands." The townsfolk caught fragments of the exchange, their whispers sharpening into defiance. Bill Carter, still skeptical, tried to argue, but his voice was drowned by Reverend Lewis's steady words. "The world has seen loyalty today. They will not let you call it property anymore." John stood silent through it all, his hand on Valor, his eyes distant yet steady. He had never sought attention, never wanted a spotlight, but he understood now that the bond he had carried in silence for 5 years had become a symbol far beyond himself. Ethan tugged at his sleeve. "They know now, don't they?" John looked down at the boy, his expression softening. "Yes, son," he said quietly. "They know." The sound of the helicopter drew nearer, the rhythm of its blades pounding against the air, stirring dust along the edges of Main Street. Cross's voice cut through the noise. "Captain, the transport is inbound. You'll be taken in for debriefing. The dog will be transferred as well. Public opinion changes nothing." But even as he spoke, his phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen, his composure cracking just slightly. Comments, headlines, even congressional tags flooded his feed. Lawmakers, veterans, families, voices rising in unison, declaring that a bond forged in war could not be reduced to equipment. The crowd sensed it, their courage swelling. Anna Reed stepped forward once more. "Maybe jurisdiction doesn't end here, Agent, but loyalty does not answer to your chain of command." Her words drew nods, murmurs of agreement, the line between bystander and participant blurring. The world had entered Miller's Crossing not with soldiers or weapons, but with screens glowing in countless hands. Cross exhaled, his composure strained. "This complicates everything," he admitted under his breath, though loud enough for Dawson to hear. Dawson scowled, his authority slipping through his fingers. Megan's eyes shone with quiet defiance as she looked at Valor. "Complicated or not, the world has already chosen." The helicopter thundered closer, the wind whipping dust and grit across the street. John's gaze turned upward, steady, resigned. He had seen extraction before, had felt the weight of leaving behind more than he could carry. But this time was different. This time the world was watching. The roar of the helicopter swept through Miller's Crossing, rattling windows and stirring dust into spirals that danced across the sun-baked street. Townsfolk shielded their faces from the wind, but their eyes stayed fixed on the center of it all. John Walker, standing tall, Valor steady at his side, and Agent Samuel Cross caught between federal orders and the undeniable force of public opinion already surging beyond the borders of the desert town. Cross held his phone in one hand, the screen glowing with messages from his superiors. He read them in quick glances, his jaw tightening. "Stand down until further notice," one line read. Another harsher warned of political firestorms ignited by the viral video. He exhaled slowly, his composure cracking for the first time since he arrived. Dawson, red-faced and restless, tried to shout above the helicopter's blades. "Are we taking him or not?" Cross ignored him. Instead, he looked at John with a heavy gaze, one soldier to another, though their uniforms had been different and their duties never aligned. "Captain Walker," he said, raising his voice just enough to carry over the thrum of the rotors. Your transport is canceled. Command has determined that extraction would escalate the situation beyond control." The crowd gasped, relief and triumph mingling in their voices. Ethan Miller cheered, his small hands clapping, while his mother Laura pulled him close with tears in her eyes. Anna Reed allowed herself a rare smile, the corners of her mouth softening after years of reserve. Dawson sputtered, his authority collapsing. "You can't just walk away from this," he barked, but the words sounded small, swallowed by the roar of the helicopter now circling away, its mission aborted. Cross turned toward him, his tone curt. "It's already out of our hands." Washington made the call. "You'd be wise to let it go." With that, he closed his phone and stepped back, folding into the role of observer rather than enforcer. John lowered his eyes briefly, his hand resting on Valor's head. The shepherd leaned against him, calm, unafraid of the noise, his tail giving a small, steady wag, as if sensing the storm had passed. John spoke quietly, his words not for authority, but for the town gathered around him. "You all gave us back more than a reunion. You gave us a homecoming." His voice faltered just slightly before he steadied it. "That's something neither of us thought we'd ever see again." Reverend Lewis lifted his hand, his voice carrying the weight of both age and faith. "Then let this town be the place where loyalty is honored, not questioned. Let this moment mark what should never be forgotten." The crowd murmured in agreement, nods and soft voices weaving together into something that felt sacred beneath the blazing sun. Days passed, then weeks, and the story did not fade. News outlets replayed the footage until it etched itself into the national memory. Editorials called it a reminder of the humanity often buried under procedure. Veterans across the country wrote letters telling their own stories of dogs who had saved them of bonds that had outlasted wars. Donations flowed into Miller's Crossing not for profit, but for tribute carried by strangers who wanted to leave something behind in honor of what they had witnessed. And so the townsfolk gathered at the bus stop shelter where it all began, tools in their hands and sweat on their brows, building something that would last. They cleared the rusted bench, reinforced the cracked concrete, and set a new bench of solid oak polished by local carpenters. At its center, they placed a small brass plaque engraved with words chosen by Anna Reed, but agreed upon by all. "To those who serve and those who wait, loyalty is never forgotten." Beneath it, a silhouette of a soldier and a shepherd stood side by side. On the day of the unveiling, the town gathered again. Reverend Lewis spoke briefly, his voice steady. What happened here was not a spectacle. It was grace, a reminder that even in the harshest deserts, loyalty endures. This bench is not for the past alone. It is for every person who passes through and needs to remember that no one is truly alone. John stood beside Valor, his hand resting gently on the dog's collar. He said little, only offering a nod of gratitude to the people who had turned his silence into a legacy. Ethan rushed forward, placing a folded drawing he had made a soldier with a dog by his side on the seat of the bench before running back to his mother. Megan Scott approached quietly, her eyes on Valor. She carried with her the canvas chew toy embroidered with the word faith, worn from years of training. She held it out, her voice low. "He always liked this. I think it belongs with him now." John accepted it with a small, rare smile. "He'll keep it," he promised. Valor took the toy gently in his mouth, his tail wagging with quiet joy, and laid it at John's feet, as though sealing the moment. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the street, and the people of Miller's Crossing lingered by the bench, their voices soft, their faces marked by something more enduring than curiosity, respect. For John and Valor, the road ahead was still uncertain, but the bond they carried was no longer invisible, no longer hidden in silence. It had become part of the town's story, part of the nation's memory, and part of a legacy that no government file could ever contain. Every bond leaves a mark some louder than words. If you believe in second chances and loyalty that never breaks, make sure to like this video and subscribe. I'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments which part of this story touched you, and let us know the city or country you're watching from.